Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. From the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina to the Trayvon Martin case to the recent scandal ensnaring a National Basketball Association owner, no one more incisively covers the intersection of race and media than today's guest. Award-winning press critic Eric Deggans is among the bravest and most astute cultural journalists of our age. A longtime writer for the Tampa Bay, now formerly St. Petersburg Times, last year Deggans became National Public Radio's first ever TV critic. He's also the author of Racebaiting, which reveals how racebaiting, once the practice of unfairly targeted racism against minorities, has become recast to impugn those who fairly raise discussions of prejudice in the public square. The book powerfully reminds us how certain media, to this day, perpetuate the stereotypes of birth of a nation. I want to ask Eric Deggans today about this manipulation of race baiting into a negative term for people who honestly discuss issues of race in America. When did the media begin to tolerate this perversion of its meaning? And why, Eric, has the audience, seemingly for way too long, permitted it, tolerated it?
Well, first of all, I just got to say that introduction was amazing. Thank you so much. I'm so intimidated having to live up to that now, but thank you so much for your kind words. I guess what I would say is that the point of the book is that this stuff has become a money-making dynamic for media. So as media outlets realized that there was money and profit in segmenting out pieces of the audience and super serving them their worldview, then that became something that the media outlets wanted to do, and of course the audience bought into it. So Fox News, for example, I single them out because they're one of the media outlets that has been most successful at this and has done it the longest, and it seems to be most aggressive about it. You look at Fox News, they don't come out and say, you know, we're the white people channel or we don't believe in institutional racism. But when you look at how each of their hosts talk about race, when you look at how they explore race-based controversies like the Trayvon Martin situation or the death of Chris Lane, an Australian baseball player who was killed while on a morning jog, or even the Donald Sterling controversy. When you look at how they talk about these issues, you get a sense they're coming at it from a certain perspective, and they're reflecting the ideas and perspectives of their target audience. So when they reflect that out there, their target audience binds to them closer and then doesn't want to go to MSNBC or CNN or PBS to see views that maybe contradict what they feel, because they come to Fox and Fox sort of tells them, how you feel is okay, how you feel is all right. And that would be okay if it was just, well, I mean, for a news channel that's never okay, but it would be less harmful if it wasn't also about passing along these damaging stereotypes and these damaging prejudices and this inaccurate idea that institutional racism and structural racism doesn't exist anymore, which just isn't true.
Well, is that racism displayed on Fox News? If you don't call it racism, would you call it a bigoted perspective, prejudicial? What exactly would you call it?
Well, what I would say is you could look at, and I have different incidences that have happened on Fox News, and you can see a range of different behavior. So when Glenn Beck went on Fox and Friends and said that Barack Obama was racist, okay, that's one sort of level of ignorance, right? And then when you look at the way Eric Bolling, who is another one of the Fox anchors, he went on and he criticized a black female legislator by comparing her to Whitney Houston on a crack pipe. Well, okay, that's another level, of ignorance. I would hesitate to use the word racism because I reserve that word for the most obvious forms of racial prejudice, race-based prejudice. But I would say that it's prejudiced, I would say that it's biased, I would say that it is about elevating the worldview of one race of people over the concerns of others and pretending you're not doing it. And that's pernicious, because what ends up happening is you turn a blind eye to a lot of dynamics in society that are displacing people, that are hurting people, and in the end, what's ironic about all of this is that working class and middle class white people who watch Fox News are being trained to turn a blind eye to issues that affect them as well. right? So when you look at, I remember when affirmative action programs were being challenged across the country. This was a while ago, say 10 years ago. And so Washington State did an analysis to try and figure out, okay, exactly who is benefiting from these programs. And what they found was that military veterans of any race were benefiting most, and mothers, women, and then people of color, right? So people had this idea that affirmative action programs were some sort of special benefit for people of color, and what they didn't realize was that people just like them were also benefiting from them. And I think that's one of the things that's also sort of pernicious about these ideas, is that it distracts people from solutions to institutional racism and prejudice that can benefit everybody, not just people of color.
I was precisely going to use that word pernicious and ask you if this notion of race baiting, the manipulation of race baiting, is that attributable or born out of this same kind of reverse racism idea?
Well, again, I think what happened, one of the things I talk about, for example, is the history of the man who created Fox News channel, Roger Ailes. And Roger Ailes is somebody who started as a TV producer. He was a producer for the Mike Douglas Show, and then he became a political consultant and operative. He consulted with Nixon on his election campaign when he was first elected president in the late 60s. He wound up working with Ronald Reagan and working with George H.W. Bush. And Roger Ailes learned how to take the ways of talking about issues that politicians used at that time and put them to use in television. And what ended up happening is that Nixon in particular used what people call the Southern strategy. So he realized that there were a bunch of really disaffected white Southerners, Democrats mostly, who were upset with the civil rights advances that had been made in the 60s, particularly the end of segregation, particularly the Civil Rights Act, particularly laws striking down laws against interracial marriage and interracial romance and those sort of things. So Nixon was able to come forth and very subtly say, you know, I'm with you on this. You know, I'm not going to force you to integrate your schools. I'm not going to force you to integrate your neighborhoods, and win the support of those Southern Democrats and actually turn them into Republicans. And I think Roger Ailes learned that lesson. And he learned that there was a way to talk about race and a way to talk about prejudice in a way that made white people feel good, that would draw them to you and keep them from going to other people, keep them from supporting other places. And he has built that, I think, into the marrow of Fox News. And we see it whenever they talk about something that involves race.
So this is really a proactive move to facilitate a culture war as opposed to avoidance of the questions that we regularly neglect about race and the condition of people of color and other minorities in this country.
Well, again, I think the ultimate goal of some of these media outlets is to reflect the worldview of the people, their target audience, the people they want to come to them. So the idea is to say to the average Fox News viewer who is overwhelmingly white, much older, the average age for, when I did the book anyway, the average age for Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly's shows in their late 60s, right? The average age of the viewer. so half their viewers are over 70, right? So the average Fox News viewer is older, politically conservative, overwhelmingly white, more male than female. So you create a channel that speaks to those interests, and when it comes to race, you create a channel that says, look, there's a bunch of people out there who want to get something for nothing. They're constantly complaining about institutional racism, but you're having a hard time too, and you're just as likely to be discriminated against because of your race as they are, and everything's equal out there, and here's some examples or some proof about why that's true, and let's talk about Trayvon Martin. You know, that's sort of that's the MO. That's the tactic. And so what I try to do in Racebaiter was take a look not just at Fox News, but take a look at talk radio, take a look at unscripted television, so-called reality television, take a look at scripted television, take a look at all these different areas. I took a look at the conflict between MSNBC and Fox News and how that tends to degrade people's enthusiasm and confidence in journalism in general, because they see these two ideologically opposed news outlets pitted against each other, and they sort of say, well, you know, who can you trust, right? It's a natural question. So I try to look at all the different areas of media where I see these kind of interplays going on, and number one, I want to tell people how race works in these contexts. I want to tell people how media works, because I often say that if you want to understand what happens in media, 90% of what happens in media is about somebody making money or somebody losing money, right? So if you can figure out how somebody's making money or somebody's losing money when, for example, Glenn Beck goes on Fox and Friends and says that Barack Obama's racist, if you can understand the economic imperative behind that, then you understand why the channel does what it does, right? So, so I try to do that in the book, and it's not just about Fox News. There's a lot of corners in media where this happens, but I think it's important for us to understand it so that we understand our media and we understand ourselves.
But it's Fox News that's so often declaring that there is a culture war against them. Right?
Well, Fox News and talk radio does that too.
Right.
You know, Rush Limbaugh does that as well. You look at websites like Breitbart.com or newsbusters.org, conservative media websites, they do it as well. It's a standard tactic, yes.
So let me ask you, because this whole question of prejudice versus racism and the inequality of perspectives on television, we're engaged in this major media convergence where we're seeing the internet, and you work for NPR, but obviously have a multifaceted digital approach to the news.
Mm-hmm.
As we approach the subject of race in this more newfangled, complicated media arena, where do you see the greatest promise? You talk in the book about putting an end to contemporary race baiting and the fact that it will require media literacy. So as this convergence is occurring, where is your greatest hope that we're going to take you up on media literacy?
Well, one of the things that I think is encouraging about the current media structure is that when you look at how social media operates and how the internet operates, it takes power from the gatekeepers that we were used to, and it moves it down to the front line. It gives power to people who are right on the front line. So I tell people today's consumers of media have more power than they have ever had. If you see something on television that you don't like, you can go on Twitter and you can say something about it. You can make up a hashtag, and then hundreds of thousands of people can eventually glom onto that and comment on that, and eventually become so big that the TV outlet can't ignore it. You know, just as a slight sidebar, I was watching CBS's coverage of Nelson Mandela's funeral on CBS this morning. They had a great panel discussion, but at the end of it, they played a snippet of Toto's Africa, which is a song by an LA-based rock band about their fantasies of Africa because they've never been there. And so I sent out a tweet where I said, you know, it was a wonderful discussion, but couldn't you have found an African band to play, you know, as you end this discussion about Nelson Mandela? And so that got retweeted and retweeted and retweeted. Now this was just a tweet. The only reason I wrote it as a tweet was because I didn't think it was significant enough to make it a story, right? It was just a comment. It got retweeted and retweeted. Slate wrote about it. The Huffington Post wrote about it. All these media outlets started picking it up. And by the end of the day, David Page, the keyboardist and co-founder of Toto, released a statement where he said he wished that they had used a different song. And so then I ended up writing a story about it the next day after that happened. But I sort of felt like that's a perfect example of putting an idea out there that's just an offhand comment that frankly anybody could have made. And then the world gets a hold of it. And they say, wow, that's a good idea. Wow, that makes some sense. Wow, you know, and they build on it. And then the next thing you know, CBS can't ignore it, right? And the next thing you know, Toto weighs in and says, look, you know, this guy's right. And so I think everybody has a little bit more of that power right now. So that's the one encouraging thing. The other thing is that if you look over in scripted television, if you look at what ABC is doing now, what Fox is doing now in terms of how they're casting their shows, ABC right now in the fall is going to have on Thursday nights 3 shows that were created and are run and scripted by a black woman, Shonda Rhimes. 2 of those shows will star a black woman in the lead. That has never happened in the history of network television. When Shonda Rhimes created Scandal a few years ago, there hadn't been a show, a drama, that starred a black woman on television for 30 years. Right? And now we're to the point where we have 2 of them in the space of 3 years. I mean, it's amazing. So scripted television has realized that it can make money if it puts on shows that look more like America, right? And they realize that they have to up the diversity in the characters and the people who write the shows and the people who create the shows and the subject matter. So I think ultimately, if the audience changes, then the media outlets make more money, then they change. So what I'm trying to do in the book media literacy is so important so that the audience changes and the audience uses its power to demand that this stuff stop happening.
And it's also important if you're encouraging citizen journalists, as you are.
Sure.
So, what are some of the golden rules that we had Jim Katz here before, professor of media literacy and emerging media at Boston University. What would your golden rules be for the use of new media to encourage professional journalists to cover matters like Trayvon or like the Donald Sterling situation, perhaps more objectively? And do you think that citizen journalists have a greater role to play in ensuring that the coverage of race relations is fairer?
Well, I think citizen journalists have a role. I think when it comes to covering race and prejudice is sensitive work. It's work that takes experience. You really have to know how to navigate these issues as a journalist. So I think sometimes citizen journalists are not the best people to constantly pursue these issues because it's easy to make mistakes. They have the passion and often they have the ground level knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the expertise to sift through this stuff in ways that you really need. But what I think professional journalists need to keep in mind is that, number one, we need to talk about race more than when there is some sort of pernicious news event, right? Trayvon Martin gets killed, all of a sudden we want to talk about race. Donald Sterling says something awful, all of a sudden we want to talk about race. When you watch the evening news, they mention how the Dow did every day. Whether or not it goes up or down, whether or not it's a good story or a bad story, whether or not anything really newsy happens, they always tell you something about the Dow. We need to figure out ways to talk about race and poverty when there's not this big, huge news story, because when there is a calamity, people get very entrenched in their positions. And it's, one of the things that's most important about having these discussions is people need to be willing to hear the other side. They need to be open-minded. They need to be willing to give a little bit in their positions. And people don't do that when there's some big calamity and they're worried that, for example, the Trayvon Martin case proves that black kids aren't safe walking in public where they're supposed to be minding their own business. When you're worried about that, it's hard to be open-minded in the way that you need to be to open up a dialogue about race with somebody who's not, a part of your race or your culture. So that's the one thing. We need to talk about this stuff and figure out ways to get it into news stories when it's not the main subject. The other thing we have to do, I think, is be careful about falling into these stereotypes. Tropes about black criminality, tropes about the spicy Latina, tropes about, we just have to be careful because, in today's media, we have less and less time to do everything. We have less and less space in our newspapers. We have less and less time in our broadcasts. It's easy to put up something that people automatically recognize as a shorthand. But when you do that by referencing stereotypes and prejudice about Latinos or about black people or about women, then you wind up encouraging those stereotypes instead of undercutting them. So I'd say that's really important. And then the other thing is we've got to have a more diverse selection of people who are actually reporting the news. One of the things that's a little discouraging when you look at cable news, for example, you look at CNN, you look at Fox News, you don't see very many anchors of color there. You don't see very many reporters of color, enough reporters of color as far as I'm concerned. If you have more people of color and you have more women and you have more gay people, you have wider diversity of people actually reporting these stories, then when a story comes up, somebody can say, oh, I experienced this in kind of a different way. Did you think about this? Did you think about trying that? Did you think about talking to this person or talking to that person? And all of a sudden, the coverage broadens. So I think the other thing you have to have is a wide diversity of people covering these issues to make sure that all the perspectives get, reflected in the end product.
And as a veteran media critic and now media TV critic for NPR, where do you turn for that news? Obviously, there are talented individuals of color like Don Lemon, for example, on CNN,
Sure.
who's done some fabulous work around not just these big stories, but the day-to-day conditions of life in African-American communities. What are some other examples of people you're actively turning to on the tube now?
Well, I would say, not to toot my own horn, I'm going to sound like a suck-up, but I love NPR. I was an NPR geek long before they hired me, and I think they try really hard to get diversity right, particularly when you listen to their news programming, you hear a wide diversity of issues and a wide diversity of subjects and a wide diversity of reporting. So I like NPR a lot. I like the BBC. I think they do a good job. I tend to use Twitter as a sort of clearinghouse for news sources. So I do like the way in which some news outlets that are focused on people of color have a great social media presence. So I like The Root, which is owned by NBC, but it's a black-focused media site. I think the Huffington Post and their Black Voices site, and they have other sites devoted to gay issues. They have offshoots of the site devoted to gay issues and devoted to Latino issues and devoted to women. And they all do a really good job of exploring those issues and then bringing them back to the mothership, which I think is important. So there's, I think what you have to do is you have to develop a wide spectrum of trusted sources, and when something happens, you have to kind of see how everybody's covering them, because nobody's going to totally get the story right on the first blush. Even something as obvious as Jill Abramson getting fired as executive editor of the Times. Well, a respected reporter, Ken Auletta, reported that perhaps it was because she spoke up about a pay disparity. And people were worried about that because that hinted at issues of can women assert themselves in the workplace without being penalized in ways that men aren't? And are women getting paid the same at the New York Times as everybody else in the first place? It raised a host of issues. Later, some journalism emerged to suggest that maybe that wasn't the reason why she got fired, and that this pay disparity idea may have just been a side issue. So if you consult a wide variety of sources, you hear that point of view, but then you hear another point of view, and then you're able to put it all kind of in context and figure out what's going on. And I do that a lot with race stories. When you see something bubble up on Twitter especially, or social media, you hear about something initially, my first impulse is to say, what are other people saying about this? What's the other reporting out there? Particularly reporting. I'm not as interested in hearing about people's points of view about an issue until we have the actual incident itself kind of reported out and we know what the facts are. So early on, I want to know, who's reporting on this? Is the New York Times reporting on this? There's a great blogger, well, he wouldn't want me to call him a blogger, an online columnist named Richard Prince, who works out of DC, who has a platform called Journalisms. And he does a lot of work on journalism and race and social issues in America. American media. So if I hear about something in particular that involves race and media, I might go to Richard's column and see if he's reported anything on it because he's so good. And so over time, you try these things, you develop a list of trusted sources, but people always ask me, where's the one place? Where's the one place I can go? And I'm like, that's an old school idea. That's old media. There is no one place anymore. I say with great power comes great responsibility. Like, I'm a comic book geek, so I'll steal that line from Spider-Man. But with great power does come great responsibility, particularly as a media consumer. I just said, media consumers have been handed all this power now. They have the ability to affect what these media outlets do because these media outlets can track what they're watching and they track the chatter. So if you talk about something on Twitter or on Facebook in a negative way, they can see it and they can react to it. So you got a lot of power. Now you got to exercise the responsibility and make sure that you're well informed, and you can't just go to one source anymore. You got to make sure you check things out.
And as you note in Racebaiter, these companies are also looking at the bottom line.
Sure.
And the financial implications of media personalities and whether they're willing to sacrifice someone who makes bigoted statements.
Sure.
Where do you see the future going for some of the folks we've mentioned earlier in the program who do display prejudiced ideas? Is the bottom line ultimately going to advance the financial interests of the company? There's going to be protests, there are going to be advertisers who pull out. Are those circumstances more realistic now than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
I think it's always been about a couple of things. It's been about can you affect the money-making of the entity? So if somebody comes out and says things that seem to be prejudiced, can you make that outlet hurt financially in some way to show them that there's a cost to supporting those ideas? And then the other thing is whether or not those ideas fit into the overall brand of the media outlet. I think Glenn Beck, again, is a perfect example because when he came out and called Barack Obama racist, that motivated a whole cadre of activists to go after his sponsors. And they really targeted him to try and tell all the people who were buying commercials in his show to say, you know, do you really want to advertise with a guy who would go on television and say this kind of thing? And it was successful enough that it really hurt the show. And then in conjunction with that, Glenn Beck and Fox News had a lot of conflicts over how he fit into their overall strategy, how he fit into their brand, how much autonomy he could have as a broadcaster. And so when you have somebody who's having trouble with sponsors and they're fighting with their mothership, you know, they wound up parting company, and Glenn Beck went off to found his own online video area. And so that, in a way, was a success because activists targeted the money making and also were able to sort of prove that he didn't really fit into the brand of the media outlet where he was working.
I was going to ask you, Eric Deggans, to wager how much on whether some of these people are still on the air the next time. I hope that you'll join me on the Open Mind.
I would love to do that.
Thank you, Eric. And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews.